Throughout the new law, there are nearly 2,000 phrases where it says, the secretary shall do this, or the secretary shall do that. And here's one that is simply astounding. Section 4102 states that the secretary shall develop oral health care components that includes tooth-level surveillance. I'm not making this up. Tooth-level surveillance means exactly what it sounds like. Looking closely at every surface of every tooth in your mouth. Now, most of us would rather leave the decision on how each one of our teeth ought to be scrutinized to our local dentist and not to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Unfortunately, excessive government regulation abounds in the Obama administration. And the fact is, we will not get people back to work in this country if our job creators are tied up in red tape and burdened by excessive regulation. I know Daryl is so committed to helping with that at the state level. Let me give you an example of one area where I've been leading the fight. An issue of great concern, particularly to our forest products industry, is the EPA's proposed new regulation that would put new regulations on boilers and their emissions. The draft rule proposed by the EPA would cost businesses in Maine $640 million to comply. $640 million. That enormous cost is the last thing that our forest products industry needs at this difficult time. These EPA regulations are also an example of one agency of government contradicting another. Last year, the Department of Energy, in an attempt to get larger institutions to switch from fossil fuels to wood, offered Lee Academy, a school in northern Penobscot County, a $300,000 grant to buy a new wood pellet boiler to reduce the school's use of fuel oil. But the EPA's proposed regulations would drive up the cost of that boiler so much that the school said, no thanks, we're better off turning down the money. I organized a letter protesting the EPA's regulations that was signed by some 40 senators, and this does appear to be having an impact. But regulatory overkill is a persistent and growing problem. And that's why, as part of my 7-point jobs plan, and I know there are some copies around the room, I would require federal agencies to take into account the impact on small businesses, job growth, and energy costs whenever they are considering issuing new regulations. But the worst symptom of the disease of ever-expanding government is out-of-control federal spending, the accumulating budget deficits, and our soaring record-high national debt. We simply must rein in spending and get our financial house in order. The clock is ticking. America's runaway debt, more than $14 trillion and growing, poses a grave threat to our nation's future prosperity. And it's a moral issue as well. We simply cannot, in good conscience, saddle the young people of today, that table in the back of young people from the Bates Republican Club, and we're so happy to have you here tonight. But this crisis is not lying in wait for future generations. It's here today. Federal borrowing at the level that we're at now hampers economic growth by crowding out private investment by businesses and individuals. We are making it too expensive for entrepreneurs like Dick Lewiston and others in this room, and businesses to raise capital, innovate, and create jobs. And this troubles me also. Do you know who owns most of our debt right now? China. You're absolutely right. We do not want to be beholden to China or other countries that may not share our values and strategic interests. Since the last time our budget was balanced a decade ago, the federal debt has increased dramatically, rising from 33% of GDP to 62% today. And if we continue on our current course, the debt will soar to 90% of GDP in the year 2020. And there's been an interesting economic study of what happens when the debt gets that high, and it results in consequential collapses of a country's economy. Interest payments alone on the debt will quadruple in the next decade if we don't change our ways to nearly $1 trillion. That's more than $2,500 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. The numbers are staggering. In February alone, just last month, the federal government accumulated the largest monthly deficit in our entire history and spent nearly $22 billion just in interest payments. That's $775 million per day. That's more than the entire agricultural, forestry, and fishing industries of the state of Maine put together. In just 3 more years, interest payments will surpass the amount spent on education, transportation, energy, and all other spending except entitlements and defense. And by the year 2018, the amount we spend on interest alone will exceed Medicare's spending and will be the 3rd biggest expense behind only Social Security and defense. So the problems cannot wait. So where would I cut? Well, I'd start by eliminating the $6 billion that we spend each year on subsidies for corn-based ethanol. I'd freeze overall discretionary spending to save $400 billion over the next 5 years. I'd eliminate price supports for wealthy corporate farmers. Maybe it's because I'm from Aroostook County that this bothers me so much. But the idea that if you grow corn, you get a subsidy, and you grow potatoes or blueberries, you don't, is just not right. and that you can get a subsidy if you grow soybeans, corn, wheat, those row crops in the West or rice in the South, even if you're making more than $250,000 a year, that's just an outrage. And I've cut billions for an extra aircraft engine that the Pentagon does not want. And we must eliminate billions in improper payments, duplicative programs, and outright fraud. On March 1st, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, issued a devastating report looking at duplication and overlap in federal programs and agencies. Across the government, everywhere GAO looked, it found 34 program areas, not individual programs, areas, rife with outrageous redundancy. And this cost the American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. So I've asked my chairman on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs to start with a series of hearings so that we can identify and drill down into this report. And what I've found so far is actually the problem isn't merely duplication, but advanced multiplication. Here's just a few examples. There are 15 federal agencies involved in food safety. There are 80 economic development programs that overlap. And perhaps this last example, which I'll give you tonight, is the most ironic. 20 different agencies and 56 programs are engaged in helping Americans improve their financial literacy. Now, I would suggest to you that the American people could teach government a thing or two about financial literacy. And most basically, that we should pay for something once, not dozens of times. I am firmly opposed to President Obama's budget, which would produce a record high $1.6 trillion deficit. That is a one-year figure. We're projected to spend $3.7 trillion and only take in $2.1 trillion. I've opposed his past two budgets for the same reason. We're now in the midst of a fiscal storm, and we must make tough decisions now. I have concluded that we need a straitjacket to restrain spending. And that is why I have co-sponsored a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. This is a strong protection that I first co-sponsored back in 1997, my very first year in the Senate, and I cannot help but think how much better shape we would be in now had it passed back in 1997. Just a few days ago, I voted against the Democrats' bill to fund government for the rest of this fiscal year. Their bill called for only $4.7 billion in cuts. That simply is not a serious effort given the urgent need to address our nation's fiscal imbalances. And I am so disappointed that the President has utterly failed to show any leadership at all when it comes to that.